Terraria can be buggy sometimes, but the arguably most broken version of the game is the current update, 1.4.4.9. It's so broken, in fact, that I thought it might be possible to beat the game only using glitches. And not in a speedrun sense where I use them to beat the game faster, but instead a playthrough where I have to beat every boss by damaging them through a glitch, get every item through a glitch, and do everything else using glitches, which is exactly what this video is about. Before we start though, I'm gonna quickly go ahead and go over the rules for this playthrough, but you can skip to the timestamp on screen now to skip straight to the start of the playthrough. Firstly, each boss can only be damaged through a glitch, so I'm not able to do anything to them myself. Secondly, I'm limiting myself to a simpler version of the Transmutation glitch. So instead of being able to get any item right at the start, I'll only be able to get specific items using specific doors, which I know may sound confusing, but I'll show you what I mean later on in this video. And lastly, because I'm able to get good items through glitches, I'm not gonna upgrade my player at all, just to try and balance things out. With all that out of the way though, let's get to the actual playthrough. To start, I made a 9th anniversary secret world, just to make things slightly harder on myself. Once I was in the world though, I immediately went over to the desert and started working on finding everything I needed for the first glitch of this video, which was the Transmutation glitch. Now, I won't be explaining it here as it can get pretty complex, but it normally allows you to get any item in the game. However though, for this playthrough, since I thought that'd be too easy, I instead used a simple version of it that only allows me to get a set number of items with specific doors, which I know may sound confusing, but it'll make sense here shortly. Back to the playthrough now, I was able to get the materials I needed after carefully moving my way through the underground desert, alongside a chest statue, which will come in handy later. So I went back to spawn to get the remaining thing I needed for this glitch, which was a natural spawning trap. When I got there though, it was nighttime, so I went ahead and built some NPC houses to kill time, before eventually digging straight down to try and find a trap, and ended up finding one not too far underground from my spawn. After I made the Transmutation setup, I went into multiplayer to actually do the glitch, and then came back into the world in single player so I could start using it. This glitch works by moving across a sprite sheet from whichever sprite sheet the door is on, and we can control it by turning the Bast statue on and off. So in this case, since we're using a wood door, we are able to get the Terra Blade, Terra Prisma, and Chronos Wings. There's close to 100 different items for each door in this glitch, so while there are other items we can get from a wood door, we don't need any of them right now, as we need to move on to the other glaring issue in this playthrough. This glitch is great for getting items, but this specific version of it doesn't do anything to enemies, so we're gonna need something else for the first few bosses. Which is where the God Mode chests come into play. These are 2 unobtainable chests that stop physical attacks from hurting you, but it won't stop projectile attacks, and it also freezes your character, while also removing any summoned minions you have out. Which may seem pretty bad at first, but because it doesn't kick you off of your mount, it's one of the few ways to damage things while using one of these special chests. The second God Mode chest is easier to get, so that's the one I started working towards. To get it, I would need a meteorite door, since their sprites line up. But instead of waiting for a meteor to fall, I figured out that if I got a palmwood door, I could use that to get a meteorite furniture item from the Transmutation glitch, shimmer it, and then use that to make the meteorite door I needed. This was also when I realized shimmer was going to be a big part of the playthrough, so instead of going straight for the meteorite door, I instead wanted to get a shimmer bucket so I could use it at my base. But it was only accessible through a marble door, and the only way I could get a marble item was by shimmering one I got through a boreal door. So since I needed palmwood anyway, I decided to just go ahead and find the Aether biome. I first got some boreal wood to get the marble item I needed, and also used the boreal door to get a crown and lava bomb, which we need for King Slime. After that, I then went over to the beach beside my jungle to start looking for shimmer, which I ended up finding pretty quickly. After shimmering the marble item, I went back home and got my shimmer bucket, made a small little pond of it under my house, which ended up becoming really handy. After this, I went down to my Transmutation setup, used my palmwood door to get the meteorite item, shimmered it, and then finally used it to get the God Mode chest. At this point, I started getting ready to fight my first boss, which was gonna be King Slime, since we need its mount for the other bosses. So, I used the Transmutation glitch to make a crown so I could craft its spawner, and then went over to the corruption biome I passed on the way to the beach to actually make the King Slime spawner. Once I finally had that, I went back to my base to make my King Slime setup, which is the God mode chest above some lava, and then started the fight. The chest only protects me from physical attacks, but it also stops me from attacking while in the God mode state, so that's where the lava comes into play. And after waiting a bit while doing nothing, the lava finally took out King Slime. But I sadly didn't get the main drop I was looking for, so I ended up having to redo everything, and luckily managed to get them out on the second try. The slime mount is one of the few mounts that deals damage, and since the God mode chest doesn't take you off your mount, it's the perfect way to deal with the Dungeon Guardian. This isn't really a boss, but I thought it would still be worth beating regardless. Because I'm on the drunk seed, the dungeon is in the underground, so after finding it and dying a few times while trying to figure out how far I could go before the guardian spawned, I had my glitch chest set up ready to go. So I got on it while I was also on my slime mount, and waited as I slowly dealt damage to it, and eventually had one of them defeated after an hour and 20 minutes later. After that, the next boss I planned on doing was Skeletron, since we needed the mechanic for future glitches. So I first got another God mode chest, made some more housing, and finally made my way back to the dungeon. Once it was night, I tried talking to the old man, which didn't end up working out too well. So after respawning, I fixed the room where the old man spawns, and since I had to wait a day for the old man to respawn, I spent the time getting some other items. By using a living tree door, I'm able to get the Deerclop spawner, alongside a monolith, which we'll actually need very soon for a money glitch. And after I got done getting those items, the old man had already respawned. So I went back over to the dungeon, placed my chest, and started the fight, until my slime mount finally finished him off. Once I was done with that, I went back home and made some more NPC houses, before eventually going back to the dungeon to find the mechanic, as she's the one NPC we desperately need for this playthrough to work. Once she was moved in, I used the Transmutation glitch to get 2 Terra Blades really fast, then went to her to sell them, and buy everything I needed for the next boss, which was Queen Bee. This is the only boss that can be attacked by mimics, and they actually deal a ton of damage to her for whatever reason. So that's how I was going to be attacking her, while I was on a God mode chest to protect me from her dashes. So I went looking for a hive in the jungle, and along the way ended up finding an Eye of Cthulhu spawner. So I grabbed that, as that's the boss I planned on doing after Queen Bee. And very shortly after this, I ended up finding a hive. So after breaking in and putting together my setup, I turned on the chest statue to make mimics spawn, went down into the hive to spawn Queen Bee, and finally got back up to my setup, where I waited until the mimics eventually took her out. The night after I got home from Queen Bee, I went ahead and did the Eye of Cthulhu fight using the setup I did for King Slime, since it can only attack through physical attacks. And right after spawning it in, a fallen star ended up hitting it, taking out most of its health. So the fight was over pretty quick. After this, the next 2 bosses I planned on doing were the Brain of Cthulhu and the Eater of Worlds, but before attempting them, I wanted to go ahead and get a better mount so I could do more damage faster. And luckily, the Gelatinous Pillion was something I could get. I could only get it from a lizard door, which you normally can only get in hard mode in the Jungle Temple. But luckily, I can use a Hoik to glitch into the temple right now. So, after spending some time actually finding the temple, I made the Hoik to get inside, and then died to a trap right after. But eventually, I got back in there, got the blocks I needed, and went home to make the lizard doors. The mount was pretty far up in the sprite sheet, but after a while of me messing up my clicks, I eventually got it. The next thing I wanted to do before the 2 evil biome bosses was get flares for a future glitch, but because there's not any glitch to duplicate any item you want, I was gonna need a money glitch to buy them, which is where the monolith glitch comes into play. This is a small glitch that allows you to quickly duplicate any monolith by turning it on and off. So, using the monolith we got earlier, I made the teleporter setup, jumped into multiplayer, started duplicating the monoliths until I felt like I had more than enough, and finally went to go sell all of them to get the flares. After that, I went to go do the Brain of Cthulhu, and in my mind, I assumed I could use the God Mode chest, and more importantly, projectile to the Brain of Cthulhu from spawning in its minions. So, after breaking 2 hearts, I started shooting out the 1,000 flares needed to max out the projectile limit. And finally, once I was done with that, I broke the last heart to spawn in the Brain of Cthulhu, only to realize that it was still able to spawn in its projectiles. Luckily though, my mount and God Mode chest were able to take care of it on their own after a bit. Now, this is where I went to beat the Eater of Worlds, but for whatever reason, I realized I was missing the clip of it after finishing the playthrough. So instead, I beat the Eater of Worlds at the end of this playthrough. But for now, we're just gonna skip past it. Now, the last boss I needed to do before getting into hard mode was the Wall of Flesh. But this was gonna be pretty tough compared to the past bosses. For starters, the glitch chest would allow me to stay frozen while the Wall of Flesh moves past me, but it won't defeat it. It'll instead just despawn. So, since I was out of ideas here, I hit up Ethyriel, as he's the person behind the Transmutation glitch. As if anyone was gonna know a good glitch for this, it'd be him. And luckily, he did. He showed me how to make a machine that infinitely shoots out boulders, and because this is a glitch he discovered, and he's working on his own video specifically on that glitch, I'm not going to explain it here, but if you do want to know how to do it, then you can go check out Ethyriel's channel and see if his video on it is out. To do this glitch, I needed another God Mode chest, and a sticky boulder, and luckily, I can get it through the Transmutation glitch. The only issue though, is to get it, I would need a bone door. And luckily, I could get that by shimmering a bone furniture item I got through a cactus store. So that's exactly what I did. Once I had the boulder, I went down to the underworld by pouring shimmer on myself, and made a platform by covering the lava with a shimmer. Then I got to work on my boulder setup, and finally started the fight once it was done. All I did for this was stay on the God Mode chest, which allowed the Wall of Flesh to go past me without forcing it back in front of itself. And then I had the boulder machine dealing the damage, which allowed it to go past me without forcing me back in front of it, finally bringing this playthrough into hard mode. After this, before starting to work on the mech bosses, I did a little more building, and then used the Transmutation glitch to go ahead and get the Celestial Sigil, which I will be using later on, as we won't be able to spawn Moonlord in the normal way. After this, I started working towards the mech bosses, with the first one I planned on doing being the Destroyer. But I decided to go ahead and make all 3 spawners, as I was going to be using the same setup on all of them. For these fights, I was going to use the boulder glitch, the God Mode chest with my mount, and finally a new glitch, which is the Blood Moon statue glitch. This works by using either a bunny, fish, or penguin statue with a timer during a blood moon, which for whatever reason doesn't have a spawn limit like every other statue, so it eventually fills up every available mob slot, meaning nothing else can spawn. So once I had the spawners, I used the Transmutation glitch to get a bloody tear, and then I went to go make my setup. Originally, I thought it would be a good idea to make a new double boulder machine setup on the surface, which honestly was probably the better option. But after messing up the glitch at the very end of it, I just decided to go back to the setup I used for the Wall of Flesh. So once I got back down to the underworld to use the boulder setup I already made, I started modifying it. I added the bunny statue setup on top, added another boulder machine, a border for the boulders to bounce off of, and finally a God Mode chest in the middle. And after that, I finally started the first fight, which was the Destroyer. Because of the bunny statue glitch, only a small part of the Destroyer spawned, which stopped it from making probes that could hurt me, even while I'm on the God Mode chest. But the downside was that it took a while to defeat it, since it was barely in the boulder box while flying around. But eventually, I got it. After that, I went back and got another bloody tear, and started the Skeletron fight with the exact same setup, but this time it was a bit faster, since Skeletron would stay closer to me. This time, the bunny glitch stopped Skeletron from spawning in with its arm, since they each count as an individual mob, and since Skeletron Prime uses its arms to attack, it wasn't able to do anything to attack me. And luckily, unlike the other mech fights in this video, this fight was extremely fast, less than 4 minutes to be exact. Once I was done with that fight though, I went back to get another bloody tear, and finally started the last mech fight, which was the twins. This fight wasn't as quick as Skeletron Prime, but it was faster than the Destroyer. This time around, the statue glitch stopped the second twin from spawning in, so I only had to deal with one of them, which again still took a bit, as both of them tend to stay away from you a bit. But nonetheless, just like the other two fights, the boulders eventually came through and won the fight. And now that the mech bosses were all defeated, it was time to move on to Plantera. For this boss, I was just gonna use a boulder machine alongside a god mode chest. So, after finding a Plantera bulb after mistakenly falling into a pool of water beside the jungle temple, I got to work on making the setup. I first needed to drain the water around the bulb, and then I got to work on setting up my boulder machine. Since Plantera will stick on your player for the entire fight, assuming you don't move, I only needed one boulder machine setup right over a god mode chest, which is exactly what I built. Once I was done with that, I went down to break the bulb. And after having some trouble using the Rod of Discord to get back into my setup, I was set to sit back and watch as my mount and boulders slowly defeated Plantera, which only took roughly 5 minutes. The next boss on my list was obviously Golem, but instead of going to fight him the right way, I instead wanted to do a glitch that would start changing the world. While not super useful for me at this point in the game, you can use the Transmutation setup on an altar to infinitely break it over and over, which in turn will slowly turn every available block into a hard mode ore. Before making the setup though, I wanted to go ahead and grab a drill containment unit, as I was going to be doing a lot of digging. And luckily, the mount is on the sprite sheet of the slime door, so I was able to get it pretty quickly. Once I had that, I went over to my corruption biome and got started on making the glitch setup. The first thing I had to do was decide where my setup was going to be. And then, because breaking an altar over and over again would make a lot of wraiths spawn, I had to clear out the ground below the setup, since they like to stay at ground level. And after that, I finally got to doing the glitch itself, which is just the normal transmutation glitch setup process. And now that I had everything set up for this, I turned on an auto clicker and watched as it slowly turned my world into hard mode ores. And I mean slowly, very literally. Each time you break a demon altar, you will always get hard mode ore added to your world, but the amount of hard mode ore added each time will decrease with every altar you break. So at some point in this, I start to barely get any added to my world, but since we can break the glitched ones super fast, it still adds up quickly. Eventually though, I ended up dying, which normally wouldn't be a problem, but there was a solar eclipse, so after dying a few more times, I finally got back down to the glitched altar, and broke it over and over again for about an hour. Once I was done, I did a little exploring underground to see what I did, which is when I realized that if I wanted to turn the entire world into hard mode ore, I was gonna have to do this for way longer than an hour. So I decided that I'd come back to this after Moonlord. So I got back to working on beating the bosses, and the next one I had to do was Golem. Luckily, since I needed a lizard door from the temple earlier in this playthrough, I already knew where it was, so I made my way down there and eventually got into the room with Golem. I wasn't too worried about this fight. If anything, actually, I thought it was going to be one of the easiest ones, as a boulder machine would work super well in the closed-off room where the fight was supposed to take place. So that's exactly what I got to work on making. But once I got to the step where I needed to place wires, I realized that I'm not actually able to place wires in the temple until Golem's defeated. So I had to go back to the drawing board and come up with a new plan. My next idea was to break the left wall of the room using the drill mount, build a boulder machine with a god mode chest right outside of the left wall, and finally rush over to my god mode chest right after spawning in Golem, which is exactly where I stayed until the boulders eventually defeated him. And now that Golem was defeated, we could go on and quote-unquote fight Moonlord right now. But instead, we're gonna go ahead and do the 3 remaining hard mode bosses that aren't needed to progress through the game, starting with Duke Fishron. Now, at first glance, you might think this will be a really hard fight, but if anything, it's the easiest, as all we had to do was start a blood moon, use the bunny statue glitch to max out the mob limit, and then try to fish up Duke Fishron, which will just make him not exist at all, so much so that his name won't even appear. The next boss wasn't gonna be easy at all though, which was the Empress of Light. To start, I had to use a slime door to transmute the prismatic lacewing in a bottle, and then throw it in Shimmer to get the prismatic lacewing by itself. Then I went out to my Hallow biome, placed a God Mode chest, and started to shoot 1,000 flares to max out all the projectiles, which is kind of what I did in my Skyblock playthrough. But when I spawned the Empress of Light in, I realized that it would never get low enough to be damaged by my mount. So after some replanning, I decided to try the same setup I already had, but throw 2 boulder machines above me. And luckily, I already had 2 set up from when I was going against the twins. After redoing all of the transmutation glitches, setting up the area under the boulder machines, and shooting out all my flares, I spawned in the Empress of Light again. And the boulders were actually doing pretty well, for a bit, as the flares eventually ended up despawning, allowing the Empress of Light to spawn a few projectiles that instantly kill me. So I was back to the drawing board. I thought that since the issue was a time thing, the best option would be to just increase the amount of damage being dealt to it. So I made 5 more boulder machines to cover when the Empress of Light does her dash, and also made another God Mode chest and placed it closer to the ground. This seemed to work out really well, until we got to the last bit of its health, where it again was able to start spawning in its own projectiles. Because it got so close though, I decided to run it again with the same setup, but I just keep on shooting flares, so that way the projectile is always maxed out. And that actually ended up working perfectly. Now, I knew that with past experiences with some of these glitches, that Queen Slime seems to work differently for whatever reason, which is why I wanted to wait until after Moonlord to do it. So I skipped her and got started on the Lunatic Cultist fight. For this, I went to the tree above the dungeon and built a small house so I could teleport there after spawning the Lunatic Cultist. After that, I set up a bunny statue glitch, placed a God Mode chest, and finally started clearing out the area around my new spawn so I could set up a couple more boulder machines. Once I was done with that though, I used a bloody tear, turned on the bunny statue, and went down to start the Lunatic Cultist fight, before using my magic mirror to get back to my setup. Before I show this footage, I need to give an epilepsy warning, as my screen will be flashing a lot. So you can go to this timestamp to skip past this part. Back to the playthrough now. After starting the fight and getting back to my glitch setup, I started watching as the boulders slowly damaged the cultist. But I quickly realized that my setup was not gonna work for this and ended up dying. So it's back to the drawing board. The only thing I could really think of was to add more boulder machines, a looping teleporter system under them, and finally a zenith, so I could get a good hit on the cultist when I'm starting the fight. The zenith, surprisingly, was pretty easy to get, as all I did was use a palm wood door to get a steampunk furniture item, then used that to make a steampunk door, which is the door that lines up with the zenith. After that, I got to setting up my new Lunatic Cultist setup, which ended up being a mix of hoiks, teleporters on the ground and roof, and finally, to top it all off, I painfully made 20 boulder machines. Once I was done setting all that up and getting another bloody tear, I waited till night, turned on the bunny statues, teleporters, the boulder machines, and finally started the fight. But this setup also ended up failing again. But it did slightly better than the first setup, so I knew I was heading in the right direction at least. I decided to add more boulder machines, alongside more teleporters, and then I tried running the fight again. But this setup ended up being too good, as I would teleport too far away from the cultist, causing him to despawn. So again, I tweaked my setup by changing the teleporter setup so I would never be too far away, and started the fight again. This time, although it took a while, I was able to stay alive long enough for the boulders to take out the cultist, partly thanks to the game slowing down since there were so many projectiles and mobs. Right after I killed the cultists though, instead of the pillar spawning, they were considered automatically defeated, since the Blood Moon statue glitch maxed out the number of mobs the game allows. So Moonlord started spawning instead. My plan was to just go ahead and die to Moonlord, and use the Celestial Sigil to fight him, since it was easy to get through the Transmutation glitch. But after he spawned in, I realized my Lunatic Cultist setup was seemingly doing more than enough damage to it. So, since I already had a Celestial Sigil from the start of this playthrough, I decided to just try Moonlord again without changing anything. I went ahead and got another Bloody Tear so I could slow the game down again, and once it was night, I started the Lunatic Cultist setup and spawned Moonlord. Before showing this footage though, I need to give another epilepsy warning here, just like I did for the Cultist fight. So, if you want to skip this section of footage, you can go to the timestamp I have on screen now. Back to the playthrough now, the fight was slightly faster than the Cultist, but not too much more, as the damage really slowed down Moonlord's second phase. It was also confusing to me sometimes, as the constant white flashes of Moonlord teleporting would throw off my muscle memory of when to move into a Hoig. But luckily, after a painstakingly long time, the last boulder finally took out the Moonlord. And while beating Moonlord technically means we beat the game only using glitches without ever upgrading my character like I originally sought out to do, I still haven't fought Queen Slime or Deerclops, and I still wanted to turn my world into mostly hard mode ore, so that's exactly what I got to work on. I decided to start out with Queen Slime, and while I originally worried about how I was gonna beat her, I decided to just use the Lunatic Cultist setup again. And although I did die a few times, the boulders eventually claimed another victim, leaving only one boss left. This boss is Deerclops, and you're probably confused as to why I didn't do this fight earlier, since I went out of my way to get the spawner. And honestly, I just forgot about this boss, and must have thrown the spawner away at some point. Luckily though, it was a pretty easy fight, with me just making a single boulder machine, while having Deerclops standing under it until the boulders eventually claimed their last victim. Or at least what was supposed to be their last, as I ended up falling into them right after this. And to finally end this playthrough off, like I mentioned before, I'm gonna try and turn most of my world into hard mode ore. Last time I tried this, I only let it run for an hour, and it wasn't enough. So this time, I was just gonna let it run overnight. I had to remake the setup, as the glitch is a one-time use type of deal. So I made the exact same setup I had before, aside from adding some blocks beside me. So that way, nothing can push me away from where I needed to click at. And then I finally started using the glitch, and left it running while I went to sleep. Once I woke up the next morning, it broke nearly 2 million altars, which sadly didn't completely turn the world into ore, but it did change a good chunk of it, which is a great way to end off this playthrough. And shocker, it's not the end of the playthrough, as I forgot to refight the Eater of Worlds a day before this video was supposed to go out. The boss was super easy compared to what I had to do for the others, with me just sitting on a God mode chest while I'm on my mount, until my mount eventually deals enough damage to win the fight. And that wraps up this video. If you want to check out this world for yourself, I uploaded it to the Steam Workshop for Terraria, which is where PC players can find it. And mobile users can find the world file on my Discord, but most of these glitches won't work on mobile, sadly. I also want to give another big shout out to Ethyriel, as he has done a ton of work figuring them out and learning how to use them. Thanks for sticking to the end. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos like this in the future. And as always, make sure to have a wonderful day.